Is this on? Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to the round hall of the forecourts. Before we start, I'd like to point out two fire exits. The door you came in and the one here on my left. That's the first thing. The second thing is your phones, can they be on silent? And nothing worse than a phone going off in the middle of it. And the third thing is, this is a part of a series of lectures that you can pick up the aspects of online or see them afterwards online. And it's part of our Forecourts 100 celebration and commemoration of the Civil War and the bombardment and the siege here in this building. We have tours coming up in June, and we have an online app that we launch later in the middle of June that you'll be able to use to do your own tour if you're not lucky enough to get on one of the guided tours. So that's just a little taste of what we're doing. And to introduce this evening, I'd like to ask the Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Donal O'Donnell, to welcome you and to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and welcome to this evening, which is the fourth in our series of lectures in the Decade of Centenaries, commemoration 1922. There's a Decade of Centenaries committee, which comprises a lot of very hard-working members of the Court Service staff in conjunction with a number of judges and other interested people, and the collaboration and the energy which has been shown is really inspirational. This is, we already had a very successful exercise in 2016, and when tonight's speaker also delivered a very interesting and fascinating lecture. This year we have put a particular effort into the events of the commemoration because, as many of you may have heard me say before, some of us are aware that history walks through the courts every day, is to be found in the law reports, but 100 years ago history lived here in this building, and we are sitting almost in halfway point between the commencement of the occupation of the forecourts just around Easter in 1922 and the commencement of the bombardment in June. The Decades of Centenaries Committee is working as well in conjunction with the Beyond 22 project, which is a fascinating project and is involved in a virtual recreation of the Public Records Office, and we're also working in collaboration with the National Archives, and we hope to do something towards the end of the year to commemorate 100 years of the Free State Constitution. And as well as that, as Jerry has said, we have also got involved schools in the project and also some guided tours, some judges being press-ganged into becoming tour operators. And finally, as Jerry said, there's an app that we're very excited about, which is about to be launched in June. But a centrepiece, as far as I'm concerned, of the Decades of Centenaries is the lecture series. And we've already had some really fascinating lectures reflecting from the vantage of 100 years on what occurred in 1922. And my function in relation to the lecture series is to introduce people who need no introduction. And tonight's speaker falls squarely into that category. There are some people who have so many distinctions that they can be reduced to such great distinctions as, in this case, being Professor of Modern History in UCD, which is and has been one of the most distinguished chairs in Irish academic life. In 2019, he was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy, which is the highest accolade that can be obtained in Irish academic life. And thirdly, he's Cian Ferriter's brother. And it's hard to know which of those titles was harder won and which of them deserves greater respect. But he has written about the fascinating period in the early part of the 20th century when there was a really marvellous group of polymaths, and in one sense he reflects that himself, because in addition to a large number of really worthwhile and fascinating books, he's also a very active participant in public discourse through, for example, his articles in the Irish Times. He's first and foremost, however, a practitioner of history, and he is one of the most foremost practitioners who has exploited the use of archival material, some of which reflects work of lawyers like Kevin O'Shiel, Hugh Kennedy and others, but also court records and as a fascinating insight into real life of the people who passed through courts and had disputes of one or other variety. And the period 100 years ago, when this building was occupied by the irregulars, was that period of almost physical state of ambiguity, which is fascinating, I think, to novelists and to historians. We had a government, but no constitution. We had an occupied court building, two court systems, neither of them fully trusted by the government, two court systems and very little law. And to look back on that period tells us something about then, but it also tells us something about today. And as I say, and tonight's lecturer has one other achievement, which he reached the heady heights of being cited in a Supreme Court judgment, in the judgment of PP and the judges of the Dublin Circuit Court, when his book Occasions of Sin, which is a brilliant survey of the Irish state's treatment of sexuality and is an invaluable resource when the courts have come to look to sometimes what are called historical prosecutions. His most recent book is Between Two Hells, the Irish Civil War, which tells you, as it were, on the tin what it's about. And a previous book was A Nation, Not a Rabble, drawn from the words of a person who we all know in this building, whose photograph we walked past just a few minutes ago, George Gavin Duffy, who at the time in the treaty debates was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and he expressed the hope, or said, that the dispute that was emerging between both sides had the potential to do lasting damage to Ireland's reputation abroad and the fledgling Free State's dignity. And he tried to say to both sides that they should ensure that Ireland was seen as a nation, not a rabble. And at this time, 100 years ago, Ireland was poised and must have appeared poised between the capacity to become a nation or to descend into a rabble. And I'd ask you to welcome Professor Ferriter, who's going to speak to us tonight about that time and about the issues of democracy, defiance, and despair. Thank you very much.
Gurmagat Donal agus a chuirde is fléisiúr agus anúr bhórdom be ansa inniuh agus baválum má bhuiachas a chur anúil don príomhrethimh as a cuire a chóirtún fe ansa a nocht. It's a particular pleasure to be speaking to you in such an iconic building, dripping, as the Chief Justice has said, with history, with difficult history. But I want to begin by asking you to think of another landmark building, not too far away, Dublin City Hall. It was to that building that the Minister for Justice in the Free State, Kevin Oiggins, asked his audience in Oxford in 1924 to turn their minds to. Kevin Oiggins, as Minister for Justice, was describing the challenge of 1922 for those who supported the treaty, for those who were attempting to bed down that treaty as the ominous clouds of war gathered. And he described 8 young men standing in City Hall amidst the ruins of one administration with the foundations of another not yet built, and wild men screaming through the keyhole. It was a very memorable passage. It was designed to be a memorable passage. It was also arch propaganda. This was the era when the history wars had begun, the attempt to control the narrative of what had happened in 1922 including in and around the forecourts that we are in today. That propaganda war, of course, was fought by many different interested parties, including Frank Gallagher, a very prominent anti-treatyite who provided many pieces of propaganda for the anti-treaty side in 1922 and beyond. And he asked what he saw as the fundamental question: who has caused this conflict that is tearing the heart out of Ireland? One side or another must be responsible. You might call this, as some political scientists have, the moralist approach to the writing of the history of this period and the politics around this period. It also, I think, developed into the democracy versus dictator thesis, and that was really the narrative that Kevin Oiggins was attempting to push in addressing the Oxford Union in 1924. That those on the anti-treaty side were contemptuous of democratic principles, that they held to the Republic as a kind of a transcendental moral entity, that they were not to be reasoned with, that they were irrational. And up against them were Kevin Oiggins and his colleagues, who were unconditional Democrats, in the words of the political scientist and historian Tom Garvin, who wrote his book 1922, The Birth of Irish Democracy, to coincide with the 75th anniversary of the Four Courts crisis of the foundation of the state. I was very influenced by that democracy versus dictatorship thesis as a student of history in the late 80s and the early 90s. It also chimed with a lot of current affairs tensions, particularly in relation to the ongoing role of violence, but also the beginnings of the peace process. How people look back at the Four Courts inevitably is influenced by the winds of current affairs. The democracy versus dictatorship thesis was also referred to by the well-known writer George Russell, or A.E. as he was better known. Both sides, he suggested, came to embrace the one-dimensional mind. They beat their particular attitudes into shape, into one shape that suited them. But the historians should have the multi-dimensional mind. They should not have that idea of embracing one side or the other. They need to think about the lights that guided that generation of 1922. All of the confusions, all of the ambiguities, as well as the very public and defiant declarations. And as the distinguished Cambridge historian Richard Evans has pointed out, it is not the job of the historian to lecture the people of 100 years ago on how and why they should have done better. It's our job to try and understand them. The democracy versus dictatorship thesis is also complicated by the history of Irish democracy. Irish democracy predated 1922, predated the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. One scholar of the Civil War, Bill Cassan, has suggested, therefore, that the idea of 1922 as representing the birth of Irish democracy is problematic. The vista, he wrote, of a heroic elite who were forcing democratic principles down the throat of a recalcitrant society is far-fetched. So we do need to think beyond that. What brought nearly 200 of the anti-treaty Republicans of the IRA into this building in the spring of 1922? Can we begin to understand their mentalities, their motivations? Can we appreciate that many of them were struggling despite the defiance? Harry Boland, who wasn't here, but certainly saw himself as playing an important role on the anti-treaty side, has been described as by his biographer, David Fitzpatrick, as at once a dictator, an elitist, a populist, and a Democrat. Perhaps it was possible to be all of those things at the same time in 1922. There were also the consequences for friendships, for personal relationships, so many of which were ruptured. Consider the diary entry of Michael Rinn, for example, who was a pro-treaty IRA officer. He wrote simply, "I stand to lose 50% of my friendships as a result of what was happening in Dublin in April and May of 1922. Another version of that was provided by the playwright Lady Augusta Gregory when she recorded in her diary that her mind was tilting. One shouldn't be angry with either government or the Republicans, but with one's mind that is tilting from one side to the other for good or bad. It's difficult for people to find themselves neatly slotting into a particular perspective. Consider another iconic Dublin building, the GPO. The historian Jimmy Wren has estimated that of the garrison of 572 people that were in the GPO over the course of Easter week 1916, 41% of them were neutral during the Civil War or opted out of the Civil War. It's a very high proportion. We also have to try and understand how the IRA saw itself. It saw itself in many respects as sovereign. The way the scholar of the IRA, Peter Hart, put it, they had brought the Republic into being. It was not for politicians to give it away. And they were motivated by that. There's no doubt that there was private doubt, there were private fears amidst the public defiance. Of course, there was much contempt for what we refer to as public opinion. And yet you can see how they dated the beginning of this story to 1916, the declaration of the Republic that they were being loyal to. Consider the kind of language that's used by Rory O'Connor and his comrades with the occupation of the forecourts. The fateful hour has come, it was declared by Rory O'Connor on the 13th of April 1922. The sacred spirit of the illustrious dead is with us. The rightful cause has been treacherously assailed by recreant Irishmen. But he also wrote privately to Ernie O'Malley, another one of the occupants of the forecourts. For God's sake, beware of the compromising mind of diplomats. The skepticism about politics and politicians. And yet there's so much overlap between the two. There were 121 TDs in early 1922. 72% of them were card-carrying members of the IRA. There's uncertainty on the part of those that we have often thought of as diehards. Consider Cathal Brugha, for example. Cathal Brugha had had the last word in the treaty debates that finished in January 1922, promising that he would do his utmost to ensure that army unity was preserved, that the IRA unity was preserved. And yet that, of course, was a task beyond him. As a result, he has, according recently to his grandson, Rory, been either glorified or vilified. And we're back to these dichotomies. Cathal Brugha was just one of many who came to the forecourts during the occupation. Rory O'Connor may have announced that the fateful hour had come, but it turned out to be a fateful few months. There was plenty of time to discuss. There was plenty of traffic in and out of the forecourts over the course of April, May, and June of 1922. Cathal Brugha was pleading with those inside to think of alternative routes. He was also sceptical about the role of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, yet another complicated layer that we need to consider. He believed the IRB should be subservient to the Dáil. And he too was left confused, Cathal Brugha. I go forth now, he said, scarcely knowing where to I go. That does not suggest a righteous, certain path. But consider Liam Mellows, another occupant of the forecourts. The certainty, the righteousness. We die for truth. The mists will be cleared away. The path will be straight, but it will be narrow. Consider too the forecourts diary of Father Albert, the Capuchin who served as a chaplain to the occupants. The boys all knelt down, he recorded, and recited a decade of the Rosary in Irish, placing themselves and their cause under the protection of the Blessed Virgin. The boys here are glorious, O'Connor concluded. There's an intense religiosity shot through these kind of memories, these kind of recorded experiences at that time. There's also an intense masculinity. But what of the indignant viragos? What about the wild women in 1922? Kathleen Clark, the Sinn Féin TD, was another visitor, according to herself, to the Four Courts in 1922. In 1968, Kathleen Clark gave an interview to Father Louis O'Kane, which is held in the Cardinal O'Fee Library in Armagh. She recorded coming down to talk to Mellows, who dismissed her concerns and her insistence that the occupation of the Four Courts needed to end. You're only a woman. What would you know about it? She was furious. And this is Liam Mellows, who we regard as the more socially progressive of the Republicans during this period. Some members of Cumann na mBan braved bullets during this period. Kathleen O'Connell, for example, who of course was a faithful secretary to Eamon de Valera throughout, was carrying dispatches between the various Republican posts throughout the city, coming, in her own words, under direct fire on a couple of occasions. There were other Republican women, including Mary McSweeney, who were very active in writing to both sides. Mary McSweeney writing to both De Valera and Mulcahy. Mary McSweeney, too, had a reliance on sacred rhetoric, the notion of the Republic as the living faith, as a spiritual entity. It meant an awful lot to her. P.S. O'Hegarty, on the pro-treaty side, was later in his book, The Victory of Sinn Féin in 1924, to dismiss these women in a contemptuous way as being largely responsible for the bitterness and the ferocity of the Civil War. There was real resentment at the role that they played in propaganda. Not just McSweeney, but also less well-known figures like Dorothy McArdle. But the women were not united. And again, we have to be conscious of the false dichotomies. The women themselves were debating whether the military should serve or the military should command. We have the diaries of Rosamund Jacob, the Waterford Republican, suffragette and pacifist, who recorded in relation to the occupation of the Four Courts that some of the girls were Cumann na mBan types that loved the whole thing in a horrible way. And Dorothy McArdle found it difficult to make common cause with those she described as stronger as actionalists than herself. She wanted to use the power of her pen. She was struggling, as she saw it, to keep up with them. There was also Maud Gonne, who was desperate to bring both sides together, to get both sides to talk to the men, including Oscar Traynor, who was active in Dublin as an anti-treaty Republican, and W.T. Cosgrave, who was active, of course, as a supporter of the treaty and member of the provisional government. Eventually, they were to try and bring both sides together in the Mansion House. They sought out neutrals, such as Louis Bennett, a leading trade unionist of that era. And Rosamund Jacob referred to the more or less Free State women that she was acquainted with. And that's the point, of course. Some of them were more Free State, some of them were less Free State. Those who fell in between. So we need to think about these simplistic and exclusive dichotomies when it comes to people's affiliation. The reality was that the whole movement was in turmoil. There were those like Harry Boland who believed that he could negotiate his way through the split, through the restoration of fraternal unity. And think about the emotional complications around that in relation to former comrades. Think again about the traffic in and out of the Four Courts during this period. David Fitzpatrick has suggested in relation to Boland that whether he was driven by a laudable conviction or a grotesque delusion, the sincerity of his struggle cannot be impugned. It's a reminder of all of the attempts that were made at mediation. There were some in the IRA who were willing to talk peace. The IRA was factionalized throughout these months. Liam Deasy also left us with a memoir, Brother Against Brother. He wrote about how he and Florrie O'Donoghue and Frank Barrett were distrusted by others in the IRA. DC wrote about the fear of a number of independent armies being formed on the anti-treaty side. A number of independent armies on the anti-treaty side. It highlights the confused authority structure during this period, the sceptical view of Liam Lynch on the part of some members of the IRA. Their chief was not to be trusted. The ideas that were being floated around a Minister for Defence and Chief of Staff of the IRA of a reunited army being appointed by the Dáil, and that this would need the approval of the Army Council of the IRA. And during this period, there were IRA conventions, there were bank raids, there were robberies, there was the destruction of the printing press of the Freeman's Journal. There was the ongoing preoccupation with Northern Ireland, the new state of Northern Ireland. Both sides of the IRA were cooperating for operations across the border during this period. What the Freeman's Journal referred to as the Belfast blood orgy exercised people. Many of these events also spurred the labour movement into action. They organised a strike against militarism during this period, involving some 75,000 workers. They were adamant that the armed forces should be under civilian authority. And another visitor to the Four Courts during this period was the trade unionist William O'Brien. He actually believed that the tide of events was moving towards a vindication of Labour's stance and Labour's objectives. He believed perhaps that the disgust with what was going on within the Republican movement would lead to a focus on bread and butter issues. And like many, he had friends on both sides of the treaty divide. There were also the efforts of Lawrence O'Neill, the Lord Mayor of Dublin, and Edward Byrne, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin. To at least get them to keep their hands off each other was the logic, according to Edward Byrne, of organising a meeting in the Mansion House of both sides. Lawrence O'Neill, as Lord Mayor of Dublin, was desperate to keep the divide away from Dublin City Council, to prevent a rerun of the treaty debates at local authority level. He wasn't successful in that, but he did highlight the danger to the civilians around Church Street as a result of the bullets, the stray bullets that were whizzing by. In the midst of all this, there was also the issue of the Constitution that was mentioned a few moments ago. 9 men locked up in the Shelburne Hotel, attempting to frame a constitution for the new Free State, trying to reconcile the competing claims of nationalism, democracy, and imperialism, and the centrality of the sovereignty of the people. The important point here relates to the private assurances that Michael Collins gave the anti-treaty Republicans, including those in here, that he would produce a constitution that was a Republican constitution in all but name. But that was not going to be tolerated, of course, by the British side. Other efforts to bring both sides together included an agreement around a pact election, that both sides of Sinn Féin would nominate candidates relative to their existing strength in the Dáil in order for those candidates to be rubber-stamped by the electorate, and that third-party candidates would be allowed to contest these particular constituencies. This caused fury on the part of many. It angered Owen MacNeill, for example, another prominent supporter of the treaty. De Valera visited Owen MacNeill in Booterstown during this period to try and sell him the merits of this agreed pact election. Owen MacNeill insisted that it was nothing less than depriving people of the right to vote. And he said tellingly to De Valera, "You are lining up with a number of people who are doctrinaire extremists who you do not really agree with any more than I do." De Valera's response was, "Oh well, these people have one thing, they have faith." And that was to be a recurrent struggle for De Valera throughout this period. Where should the balance lie between faith and reason? His master ultimately, according to himself, was reason, but he was struggling, of course, to impose his authority on the anti-treaty Republicans at that stage. Robert Barton was later, in his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History decades afterwards, adamant that it wasn't De Valera who took over the forecourts, trying to dissociate De Valera from what was going on here 100 years ago. But Rory O'Connor also seemed to suggest that it was within the power of the anti-treaty IRA to prevent the holding of an election, because it would not be a legitimate election due to the ongoing British shadow. That was one of the reasons why the British reaction was so fierce. Andy Cope remained in Dublin as the senior British civil servant in Ireland. He remained here until October 1922. He was quite a good reader of the Irish situation. He had had extensive experience in dialogue with Sinn Féin in the run-up to the truce of 1921. He urged the British government to leave matters and to leave the occupation of this building to the provisional government, as they don't want, in his words, dramatic effect and funeral orations. There was an obvious imbalance in Anglo-Irish affairs. An Anglo-Irish conference that had been held a couple of weeks before the occupation of the forecourts consisted of 3 provisional government representatives from Ireland and 11 British government representatives. As the forecourts crisis became more pronounced, Churchill became more exercised as colonial secretary. He was asked by his cabinet colleagues to write to Michael Collins in his official capacity. But instead, according to Churchill in April 1922, I am writing to you man to man. He insisted that the provisional government must assert itself or perish and be replaced by some other form of control. The British government reaction to the pact election, or the agreement about a pact election, was furious. Michael Collins and his colleagues were summoned to London. The archive of those meetings held in the British National Archives in Kew are very revealing about strategies employed by both sides. Article 7 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty was seen to imply that the transfer of power to the provisional government could only happen provided every member of that government would have accepted the treaty in writing. So the idea that you could have a coalition of pro- and anti-treaty Sinn Féin in power was simply not going to fly as far as the British government were concerned. It was a violation of the treaty. There was also a suggestion from Winston Churchill that the British government had a moral right to ask for certainty as to whether their offer of arms to assist the provisional governments to end the occupation of the forecourts would be accepted or rejected. Oiggins suggested that he was like a child with a new toy about this new departure, and would be utterly inconsolable if there was any hitch. Kevin Oiggins, as a participant in some of these meetings, suggesting that this was a particularly personal project for Winston Churchill. There's an interesting issue there around Winston Churchill's deeper engagement with Ireland than many of his colleagues. And yet his mind was still one that was saturated in imperialism. The cabinet minutes in May 1922, the British cabinet minutes recorded that Churchill wants to pull the whole plant out of the ground, a reference to the whole agreement, to the historic compromise represented by the Anglo-Irish Treaty. What did that suggest about the mindset, about the power game that was at play during this period? Oiggins and his colleagues also insisted that the British government should relent in relation to this agreed election because the pro-treaty side would have an inbuilt majority. If candidates were being nominated according to their existing strength in the Dáil, well then there were more in favour of the treaty in the Dáil than against. And Oiggins made the point that Labour and farmers and independents would also be allowed to run. And Oiggins asked this question: are we to be debarred from doing our best for the treaty? Does it matter, he asked, if De Valera is in charge of education? This idea that there could be external ministers appointed by this post-election government, external ministers being those who were opposed to the treaty, who could go into harmless areas, it seemed, like education. Neville Macready, as commander of the British forces in Ireland during this period, was also coming under pressure to, in the blunt words of the British government, clear them out, them being the occupants of the forecourts, and to take them in to British custody. This was at a time when there were at least 6,000 British troops still in Dublin. Macready was wary of these kind of declarations, of these kind of commands or instructions. He was wary of those who, in his own words, ignorance of the Irish situation blinds them to possible results. This reminded me of John Maxwell, who was sent over in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising to try and restore order. Maxwell wrote letters to his wife while he was here in 1916 and suggested that for all of its obsession and preoccupation with Irish Republicans, the British government was missing something. Ever since they winked at Ulster breaking the law, he wrote, they have had nothing but trouble in Ireland. That was quite an insightful comment. It's a reminder that those, when they immersed themselves in the Irish question, could perhaps think in a more nuanced way about it. But let's not exaggerate the significance of Ireland. Let's remind ourselves just what was on the plate of the British government in 1922 when it came to colonial problems, when it came to their wider imperial project. They were dealing with all sorts of other issues. Ireland was certainly not the most pressing. But Macready was well aware of the consequences of him or troops under his command storming the forecourts and taking the leaders into British custody. Wasn't that exactly what they wanted? Churchill had also suggested that they send flying columns in to defeat the forecourts occupants. Sir Henry Wilson suggested they would be beating the air. The election of June 1922 involved 600,000 voters casting their ballots. In the event, only 34 of the 142 seats were uncontested. The Labour Party was faced with a crucial decision in 1922. Should it contest the election? Or should this be another election like 1918 that was about the national question? The Labour Party and the Trades Union Congress decided by a relatively narrow margin to take part in the election. 115 votes in favour to 82 against. It made the right decision, it seemed. It won 17 seats, 21.4% of the vote in the contested constituencies. The Irish Times was to announce in the aftermath that the Labour Party had arrived as an important and highly organised factor in national affairs. It was one of its finest hours. What did it tell us about the priorities of the electorate? That there was an appetite there for bread and butter issues. That there was a distaste for getting immersed in what many saw as quite abstract debates about the treaty, about the oath of allegiance, about constitutions. But it's significant that we hold in UCD many propaganda sheets from 1922 that highlight the way in which the Labour Party was castigated for daring to contest the election. One propaganda sheet referred to them as enemies of the northern victims of the Anglo-Orange bloodlust, that they were betraying beleaguered northern nationalists and republicans. There was also the familiar refrain that there should be a hostility in Ireland to sectional or class interests or class politics. That what the Labour Party were doing, in effect, was revealing an anti-national outlook. This trick, of course, had been tried in 1918 and was successful in persuading, pressurising the Labour Party not to take part. But not on this occasion. There was also a deep animus on display towards former Sinn Féin politicians who decided to stand as independents, including Darrell Figgis, who in the absence of Michael Collins, who of course was a busy man, had kept the Constitutional Committee work going over in the Shelbourne Hotel. Such was the anger of anti-treaty Republicans that they went to the trouble of assaulting him and shaving off his beloved beard. As Kitty Kiernan was to write to her fiancé, Michael Collins, he was lucky it was only his beard. In the event, anti-treaty Sinn Féin managed to secure 22% of the votes. Pro-treaty Sinn Féin, 39% of the votes. Independents and farmers took the rest of the seats after the Labour result that I mentioned. Roughly 2/3 of voters voted for packed candidates. The transfers between the two sides were strong. What did that suggest? That there was still a significant base for anti-treaty republicanism, yes. But it was widely interpreted as being a decision by the electorate that suggested they were broadly in favour of the treaty. But was this about the will of the people or the fear of the people? That was another one of the arguments that was used by the anti-treaty occupants of the forecourts, that this was not a free and fair election, it was held under a British threat of war, therefore the result was invalidated. Another development, of course, with profound consequences was the killing of Henry Wilson, who I mentioned a moment ago. Military advisor to the Northern Ireland government, former Commander-in-Chief of the General Imperial Staff of the British Army, a hero of the First World War. He was a self-described Irishman, an Irish unionist, born in Longford. He detested the appeasement, as he saw it, of the IRA in 1921 and 1922. It was an audacious killing by Reginald Dunn and Joe O'Sullivan. They killed him on his doorstep in London. Reggie Dunn and Joe O'Sullivan were also veterans of the British Army from the First World War. Indeed, Dunn was the son of a British Army bandmaster. There was fury, of course, on the part of the British government. There was disgust. He was the first sitting MP, Henry Wilson, to be killed in Britain in over 100 years. The British Home Secretary, and indeed Lionel Curtis, who was the Colonial Office advisor on Irish affairs, were not able to find evidence to directly link the killing of Henry Wilson to the occupants of this building. But that didn't stop them, of course, insisting that the connection was there and was obvious. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George insisted that there was the sending out from this centre, this forecourts, enterprises of murder at home and abroad. There's a new biography of Henry Wilson by the journalist Ronan McGreevy, which has been published very shortly. It contains revealing information about his own political and military journal, but also about the London IRA. And we don't think often enough about the London IRA, the turmoil that the London IRA was in as a result of the treaty, the difficulties being experienced by Art O'Brien, who was the chief Sinn Féin representative in London at that time. They too, of course, were facing the same convulsions as the movement at home. And this was partly to manifest itself ultimately in the killing of Sir Henry Wilson. But Ronan McGreevy also postulates a thesis. Without the killing of Sir Henry Wilson in June 1922, there would have been no British ultimatum to clear this building, there would have been no shelling of this building, there would have been, insists McGreevy, no civil war. I can't buy that thesis. The way Kevin Oiggins put it to his wife Bridget just before the forecourts was attacked, a move to oust the occupants is now inevitable. The situation, he said, is sad enough, but absolutely necessary. Arthur Griffith agreed. We had either to go in or to abdicate. And we can have considerable sympathy, I think, with those perspectives, given the dilemmas that they were facing, given the pressures that they were under. But an intriguing question for me relates to Griffith's earlier insistence that this occupation should have been stopped in April. Would that have made a difference? Would the provisional government have been able to manage the fallout more effectively if they had gone in earlier? We'll never know, of course, but you can see how the pressures, the layers of pressure, were building. There would have been pressure, of course, even without the assassination of Henry Wilson. Pressure to honour the election result. Pressure, of course, from Britain to deliver on what had been promised in those meetings in May in London in 1922. There's also then the question of the attack itself. What sort of state was the National Army in June 1922? It had about 8,000 members, this new National Army, but the possibility of many more. As Saerstad, the new publication of the Free State, suggested, many were going to join because of trade depression. This was not necessarily about ideology or faith. Churchill declared in Parliament in the aftermath of the killing of Henry Wilson that the British government, if the provisional government did not move, would resume full liberty of action in any direction that may seem proper to the British government and to any extent that may be necessary. No room for ambiguity there. He admitted in private to Andy Cope that his remarks were perhaps a bit tactless, but he acknowledged that it was much more important, as he saw it, that a move was made than who had actually ordered that move. The British government delivered the guns, delivered the artillery that was necessary to begin the assault. Others, much better equipped than me, can give you accounts of what that meant in military terms, of what the actual attack on the Four Courts meant and how it played out. But there is one person I want to mention here tonight who doesn't always get a look in. Constantine Curran, who needs to be brought out from the shadow of James Joyce. He was a very close friend of James Joyce. They were at UCD together in the early 20th century. But he was the first-class clerk of these courts. He was soon to be the High Court Registrar. And he had a deep concern for what was held within the Four Courts complex, in particular the material of the Public Record Office. And he too was another visitor to the Four Courts documents. He spoke to Rory O'Connor about the precious archival material, and he left, as he recorded laconically, without receiving a satisfactory reply. Con Curran was one of the first in here after the attack, when it was still a live and dangerous scene. He sent a note to the Attorney General, Hugh Kennedy. Nothing is recoverable. Incomplete, ruled. Curran's own views are interesting. He supported Arthur Griffith. He believed that a barren and naked idealism, as he put it, is never absent from Ireland. What was needed was the likes of Griffith, who he insisted aerated idealism with common sense. But his own journey had been a journey supporting Sinn Féin. He had written anonymously, for example, for the British radical newspaper, The Nation. Very few people knew about that. He had reminded both sides of the importance of the material that was contained within the Four Courts complex. There are, of course, clear-cut theories offered about the responsibility for the destruction of the Public Record Office. These perhaps were related to the thesis that I was talking about at the beginning. But I'm not convinced that the clear-cut theories are justified by the evidence. There's still much ambiguity. John Regan has made the point that the Four Courts garrison did not have sole responsibility for the destruction of the Public Record Office, that both sides put strategic military objectives above the importance of preserving a national archive. I don't think it was a particular priority for many of them. But what the explosion meant was outlined by the Irish Times in early July. The explosion had torn whole chapters out of Irish history. Ernie O'Malley was to describe pieces of white paper gyrating in the upper air like seagulls. The fire was fascinating to watch. Archivists don't like that particular passage from Ernie O'Malley. Winston Churchill wrote to Michael Collins and suggested that the archive may be scattered, but the title deeds of Ireland are safe. As archivist Katrina Crowe has pointed out, it would be nice to have both. It would be nice in particular to have the census returns of 1821 up to 1851. With the evacuation of the forecourts, there was an attempt by some to seek out old comrades. Niall Harrington, for example, on the National Army side, described seeking out former comrades, offering them cigarettes as they were being led off. He was treated, he said, with disdain. Collins recorded a note at the time. The surrender of Rory O'Connor is important. We do not want to mitigate their weakness by resolute action beyond what is required. Let us not humiliate them, seemed to be the message that he was recording. But ultimately, what was required was not going to be the decision of Michael Collins for late 1922. How do we think about the legacy of what happened here in June 1922? The Military Service Pension Archive has transformed, for me at least, the way we can approach and research these difficult themes. It offers many new perspectives. To date, 116,000 files have been made available due to the heroic labour of those working in the Irish Military Archives on this project. Those who applied for pensions, men and women, based on their service between 1913 and 1923. It's a reminder of the lottery that 1922 represented. It's a reminder of the fractured afterlives. P.S.O. Hegarty, who I mentioned earlier on, was disdainful of those who were applying for pensions, saying that it amounted to a sorry tale of patriotic degeneration and lack of public spirit. He could perhaps afford to make that claim. Many didn't have that luxury. What we get is a preponderance of physical and mental and material hardship being laid bare, and ultimately trauma in all of its guises. Consider the fate of two Dubliners, neither well known. One outside the forecourts, preparing to attack, one inside the forecourts. On the National Army side was Thomas Roach from Upper Dorset Street. He was a veteran of 1916. He had previously been a fruit salesman. He was discharged from the National Army in April 1923 as being medically unfit. He was medically unfit due to the explosion in the forecourts in June 1922. By 1925, he was described as suffering from neurasthenia. He had deafness in the right ear. He had pains in the body and the head. Physically, he was a poor specimen. He was aged 27. The degree of disability was deemed to be 20%. He had ended up in Clonmel Mental Hospital in December 1922 due to fits. And we have his own words. "My nerves are all greatly shook," he wrote in 1924. "I sometimes fall in the street, and if out at night, I have a dread that someone is following me to shoot me." By that point, he had a wife and 3 children. "We must sacrifice everything," he wrote, "in the nature of personal comfort. It should not be necessary for me to beg for what I have earned. Physically, I can never be the same again." And you can trace the correspondence over decades, multiple changes of address. He lived ultimately until 1969. He received a moderate wound pension after he had been assessed. He received a military service pension for 6.5 years, amounting to about £32 per annum. The other individual was Paddy O'Brien, officer commanding of the Four Courts garrison, from Pym Street, had worked previously as a clerk in the Custom House dock. He was injured during the attack on the Four Courts. He died in July 1922, aged just 23, in the county home in Enniscorthy. A reminder for that some of the retreating Republicans, the Four Courts was just one leg of a longer journey. His mother Mary sought a dependence pension or gratuity in the 1930s when Fianna Fáil were back in power. She was eventually granted £100, a gratuity, not a pension, a once-off payment. The maximum allowable was £112, but she didn't get it. The Minister for Defence at the time, Frank Aiken, had pointed out that O'Brien had been earning £3.13 per week, and practically the entire amount had been contributed towards his parents' upkeep, Paddy O'Brien's parents' upkeep. The case was one of outstanding merit, according to Frank Aiken as Minister for Defence. But there was a complication. Mary O'Brien, Paddy's mother, owned a small shop in Rathfarnham. It was described as a shop of the huckster type, selling cigarettes and matches and minerals and sweets. The estimated profit from that business was 10 shillings per week. And the Minister for Finance, Sean McEntee, did not consider, in his words, that the circumstances were so necessitous as to justify the maximum award of £112. So it will be £100. Sean McEntee, who had a great fondness for expensive tailoring, gold watch chains, who lived in considerable comfort in Booterstown. A reminder once again of the lottery. There were bonds that maintained the links between those who had been in this building 100 years ago. The application, for example, on behalf of Paddy O'Brien's family was supported by Sean Lemass, who had also been in this building in 1922. Consider the status he had by the 1930s as one of the leading Fianna Fáil ministers. The Four Courts garrison remained at the core of Lemass's political organisation in Dublin. And there were annual wreath-laying ceremonies in Glasnevin to commemorate the attack until the 1970s. Hugh Early, who was also here in 1922, ultimately became Lemass's ministerial driver. Others, of course, struggled when it came to the direction that they were going in, or struggled for a purpose. Ernie O'Malley escaped from the Four Courts at the time of the attack. He was later to record that we had built a world of our own, an emotional life, but with no philosophy or economic framework. He was later to record that Britain were no longer his enemies. Each man finds his enemy within. He had the space and the funds to write about these experiences quite brilliantly, to explore them, to explore that interior. He was helped by a military service pension of £258 per annum and a disability pension of £120 per annum, which was hard-earned. Ernie O'Malley was eventually captured in late 1922. The National Army soldier killed during that capture was Peter McCartney, the eldest of 9 children from 30 acres of very poor land in Leitrim. In 1923, Peter's father received a gratuity, a once-off payment of £40. He begged for decades for more, and he never got it. The £40 was in full and final settlement of your claim. And some of the occupants of the Four Courts went on to be executed, of course, in late 1922. Rory O'Connor and Lee Mellows, perhaps the best known of them. Rory O'Connor had been a paving engineer with Dublin Corporation, earning £301 per annum. His mother and sister, an invalid brother, a nephew and niece were said to be dependent on him. But at least his mother had property in Rathgar that kept the wolf from the door. Sarah Mellows, the mother of Liam, was also an invalid. Had God spared him, he would have been my breadwinner, she wrote, She received a gratuity of £112. She spent it on food and medicine. And Padder O'Donnell, another one of the occupants, looked outside the forecourts at one stage and concluded, "I'm in the wrong war." He was a socialist Republican, but he wanted to lay the emphasis on the socialist side as opposed to exclusively on the Republican side. He lived to the age of 93. He became a very successful writer. And what about Emmett Dalton, who had to liaise with General Neville Macready when it came to the attack on the forecourts in 1922? He was already a veteran of the Somme and the War of Independence. Michael Collins was later to die in his lap. He became clerk of the Seanad. He hit the bottle and developed a drink problem. He stopped drinking. He started gambling. He became involved in the nascent Irish film industry. He had a constant restlessness, which he grappled with for the rest of his long life, which ended in 1978. Spare a thought, too, for Liam Duffy from Monasterevin, also an occupant of the forecourts. He was still interned in April 1924 until he was released. So the trauma generated by 1922, including that generated by the forecourts crisis, was deep and lasting. Many imbibed from the well of 1922. Many did that silently. Some could break out of the 1922 straitjacket. Others remained trapped. But we now have so many of their experiences and stories documented and preserved. And that, at least 100 years on, is something we can be very grateful for. Gormíle Mágwith. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Diarmaid, for bringing so vividly to life that time with all its passions and tragedies and, most importantly, ambiguities. Indeed, for shining a light or bringing to our minds the memory of Con Curran, who was the first registrar of the Supreme Court, but also left such a vivid account of the intellectual life of the early 20th century, and pictures of people of interest, of particular interest to us, like Hugh Kennedy and James Murnaghan. And listening to Professor Ferriter brought to mind yet again a quotation that the late Lord Bingham was very fond of from Sir Walter Scott, saying that a lawyer without literature or history is a mere mechanic, a working mason, but with those qualities can aspire to be an architect. And that makes me think of the fact that not only have you brought to life so vividly that time, but when you think, as we think, of the people in the Shelbourne Hotel working on the Constitution, it tells us something that is still of relevance here in this building, because the British side may have wanted a constitution to protect the treaty and the interests of the Unionists who now found themselves in the new Irish Free State. The Irish side wanted a constitution as the most clear-cut sign of independence and nationhood, and some of them thought that it might even achieve a unification that would avoid a civil war. And perhaps all of them were disappointed in those respects, but in doing so, they took the first faltering steps towards constitutionalism, something that we have all lived to benefit from. And so not only has tonight's lecture shone a light on the past and brought that past to life so vividly, but it also shines a light on the present and perhaps on the future. And so for all those things, I'd like to thank you, Diarmaid, very sincerely, and ask you to show your appreciation yet again in the traditional way.